Indigenous peoples in the Americas affected by changes in their environment linked to colonization. An analysis of the change in society and culture as a result of Spanish colonization of the Americas. What is colonialism? Colonialism is a policy adopted by a nation that aims to acquire territory outside of its borders in the hopes of attaining political and economic authority over this territory. Colonial nations often exploit these territories for economic gain and power. The conquistadors of Central America completely altered the culture and society of the Central American indigenous populations. The Aztecs were one of many indigenous populations to fall under Spanish conquest of Central America. The island of Hispaniola was also the other focal point of Spanish brutality associated with colonization. Colonization by the Spanish inadvertently decimated the Aztec society and effectively shifted the culture of the native people. Through the veil of religion, the Spanish justified their inhumane and cruel colonization of central Mexico and enforced the religious will on the indigenous population, which resulted in the destruction of their culture. The slaughter of indigenous people on the island of Hispaniola, now the Dominican Republic in Haiti, was the first instance of large-scale societal change, which ultimately caused the eradication of the native population. Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a first-hand witness of the colonization of Hispaniola, described how the Spanish, quote, forced their way into native settlements, slaughtering everyone they found there, end quote. Those men that were not immediately killed were forced to work under slave-like conditions in gold mines, and women were forced into working on farms as well as sexual subjection. The native population of the island of Hispaniola before the invasion of the Spanish was estimated to be around 8 million, but after only 3 decades, it was reduced to 20,000. The deaths of millions of indigenous people in Hispaniola is now widely considered one of the first genocides in modern human history, and it was the result of Spanish colonization. This was the first instance of maltreatment towards indigenous populations in the Americas, and it set a precedent for the atrocities that were to follow. Hispaniola's native culture had been wiped from existence due to the changes in their environment as a result of Spanish colonization. After the discovery of Hispaniola, the Spanish ventured further west until they discovered Mexico and the Aztec civilization. Hegemony over the Mexican region began in 1519 when Hernán Cortés arrived in Veracruz on the eastern coast of Mexico. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was rapid, taking only 3 years for the Spanish to take control over the vast majority of Mexico. This conquest of Mexico was endorsed by the Catholic Church in Spain, as they believed converting the indigenous populations to Christianity was important. However, the conquistadors used this concept of religious proselytism as a means for marauding in the search for gold and precious materials. Historian Ursula Lamb describes how the Spanish sought to convert the indigenous populations and how this was fundamentally flawed, as, quote, conversion was inescapably tied to conquest, end quote. In order for the native Mexican people to avoid persecution and discrimination from the Spanish, they were required to renounce their Aztec gods and accept Christianity as the one true religion. This was an extreme shift in the culture of indigenous Aztecs, as their way of life was now suddenly uprooted and what they had believed in previously was abruptly discredited. The religious shift in Aztec culture was more than a spiritual change, and according to Lamb, quote, the unsettling of religious patterns of habit involved the dissolution of their fundamental ways of life, end quote. The effects of changes in the religious environment of Mexico can be seen today, as Mexico is seen as predominantly a Christian country which has adopted Christian culture and celebrations such as Easter and Christmas, that of which are not native to the indigenous population. The cultural hegemony of Mexico and later South America reflects how effective the blueprint of Spanish colonization was, and helps us to understand why the conquest of Mexico was carried out so swiftly and competently. The conquistadors of Mexico widely believed the indigenous population to be inferior to them and less of human quality than themselves, often thought to be more animalistic in their nature. In letters sent back to the King of Spain during his time traveling, Hernan Cortes, who led the invasion of Mexico, reflects the attitude of the Spanish towards the indigenous population. Quote, I took with me several of their principal men and some of an inferior order. End quote. In order to civilize the indigenous population, many Spanish conquistadors sought to baptize and convert them to Christianity, which was widely considered the only way to cleanse the indigenous so they were no longer considered primitive. This notion of civilizing the indigenous population was a heavily Christian belief and assisted in the hegemony of the Aztec culture. The widespread hegemony of the native Aztec culture by the Spanish has significantly altered the religious and cultural landscape of modern-day Mexico. The number of Mexicans currently that identify as being indigenous is approximately 25 million, which is the exact same number of indigenous peoples estimated to have been alive before the Spanish conquest of Mexico began in 1519. Which means it has taken 500 years for the indigenous population to recover from the Spanish conquest, and the millions of deaths of indigenous peoples that were a result of disease and war. However, anthropologist Guillermo Bonfil Batalla suggests that native Mesoamericans and their struggle to survive and maintain their cultural roots, even after attempted de-Indianization of their culture, has given them an immense willpower to prosper despite their difficult circumstances, indicating a change in how indigenous Mesoamericans are treated in a modern society, and a shift towards a greater recognition of the wrongs inflicted upon native Mesoamericans by Spanish conquistadors. This is a positive shift in the modern culture of indigenous Mesoamericans towards a more equitable Mexican society, inclusive of the native population. Now, a reflection. When I started this presentation, I was unaware of the extent to which the Spanish had destroyed indigenous culture and society in Hispaniola and Mesoamerica. The sheer amount of deaths as a result of colonization and the erosion of culture has resulted in a loss of cultural diversity within the Mexican and Latin American region as we see it today. Conquistadors such as Hernan Cortes displayed extreme cruelty towards the indigenous population, massacring thousands for his own personal greed. I now have a greater understanding of the severity of the events of the Mesoamerican colonization, and believe it to be an abhorrent exhibition of how colonization can destroy a society and its culture.